Being that the whole planning commission is here, we will call this meeting of the Narberth Planning Commission, the January 2021 meeting of the Narberth Planning Commission to order. I'll recognize that Jim Spear, Jim Cornwell, Dave Brower, and Heidi Boyes are with us tonight. We have Maggie Dobbs, our planner from the Montgomery County Planning Commission, is with us. We have two guests who will be speaking on the agenda. Corey Cagarisi from the State Historic Planning Office and Kathleen Ablanau from the Lower Merion Conservancy. And we have two members of the public with us, including Councilmember Michelle Pananopoulos. You both to our meeting. Tonight's agenda, which was published last week, included brief reorganization, announcements, updates. The bulk of tonight's meeting will be discussing what the steps would be for the borough to proceed with the recommendations of the Heritage Action Study that Corey and Kathleen helped write, and the recommendations the Planning Commission forwarded to Council about a year ago. We did last month discuss the Omnibus Zoning Amendment and voted to recommend it to Council. We did receive since then a letter from the Montgomery County Planning Commission with some comments on that. So we'll take a minute to review those and see if we would like to change our recommendations in any way. And then we'll have public comment. There will be no discussion of any development applications tonight. None of the applicants are prepared with proposals that they would like to discuss. So that's our agenda for the evening. We'll begin with reorganization as we do at the beginning of every year. We choose officers for the coming year, and we confirm our meeting dates for the coming year. And so in terms of officers, we have a chair, we have a vice chair, and we have a secretary. And so I would like to know if anyone would like to make any nominations for the person who should serve as chair for the coming year. Don't know. Jim Spear. Would you like to
yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. I would like to nominate Todd Bressie to serve as chair for the coming year.
Okay. Thank you, Jim. Are there any other nominations? Okay, so is there a second for the nomination of me to continue? Jim Cornwell. All in favor of that nomination, say aye.
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 Opposed? Okay, thank you all. And
Keep up the good work, Todd.
Thank you. And I heartily accept the pay raise you're about to vote me as well.
100%.
The second officer, pardon me, second officer is vice chair. And so I'll accept nominations for vice chair. I would like to renominate Dave Brower to continue as vice chair for the coming year. Are there any other nominations? Okay, so is there a second for that nomination? Jim Cornwell seconds, and Jim Spear. And so all in favor of Dave Brower serving as vice chair? Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Congratulations, Dave.
Thank you.
You're doing so great.
I'll take your pay raise.
I'm going to give you a pay raise. Just
$600.
Okay. And the final officer is a secretary. And do we have any nominations for secretary? I am wondering, Jim, since you've agreed to serve at least a few more months of another term, would you be interested in continuing on as secretary for the remainder of your term?
You know what? I didn't even pull out my computer, so I will try to get that together, or I could do it on paper. So yeah, I'll do it. Sure. I'll
Thank
do
you.
it.
Is there a second? Is there any other nominations for secretary? Okay, is there a second for that nomination?
I second it.
Jim, you're going to use up all your seconds. You better save your ammo. All in favor of Jim Spear continuing for a couple more meetings as secretary? Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Opposed? Okay.
Good, thanks.
All right. Well, thank you.
Okay, we'll split that race 3 ways. Thank you all. We're a great commission, and I look forward to the work ahead of us this year. The second item of our organization is to confirm our meeting dates. I've already transferred to the borough office the suggestion that we will continue to meet on the first Monday of every month. Of course, we always have the question of Labor Day, the first Monday of September, which happens to be September 6th this year. And so I'd like to ask if there's any preference for having our meeting be on September 7th, or which is the following day, Tuesday, or September 13th. I'm not aware of the Jewish calendar. If I don't know if that's a holiday of any sort. Those tend to happen around this time of year. So if there's a conflict, we shouldn't do that.
I'll tell you in a second. Well, yeah, as it happens, Rosh Hashanah starts on the night of September 6th, and the night of September 7th is the second night.
Okay. So would it be then acceptable to everyone to hold our meeting on the 13th so that Labor Day and Rosh Hashanah, we don't have any conflicts for those who observe that holiday? Any objections to that?
It's fine.
Okay. So I will transmit to the borough the Monday meeting schedule unless there's any objections to that, and the preference to have our September meeting on the 13th. Okay, that is our reorganization. Very good. So we'll move to announcements and updates. The first item on that agenda is the approval of the minutes from December of 2020, which I transmitted you over the weekend for you to review. Once we review and approve them or amend them as necessary, I'll format them and then have them posted. Are there any comments, questions, corrections to the minutes as they were submitted to you for review? Okay, if there are none, could I have a motion to approve the minutes as submitted?
Make a motion to approve the minutes.
Second.
And Dave Bauer seconds. Any discussion about the minutes? All in favor of approving the minutes as submitted?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, they are any opposed. Okay, so they are approved as submitted. I'll clean them up and forward them to the borough office in the proper format to be posted. For the public at large, those minutes will include notes on the discussion we had last month about 3 Elmwood. So those will be posted shortly. As also for the public, our meetings are now archived on the Narberth Civic Association webpage, so you can always watch those conversations yourself whenever you'd like. We'll move to the Montgomery County Planning Commission update, which primarily is a report from Maggie on her work plan. Maggie, would you like to update us on your doings?
Yes, so we are continuing our work on the subdivision and land development ordinance updates. Those are moving forward. We have a meeting scheduled in 2 weeks from now, along with our this is part of our regular monthly check-ins with the engineer and the zoning officer as we pursue our updates. So we are moving through those final updates of the design standards. I do anticipate that this only taking us a little bit longer oh, I'm sorry. If you're hearing a loud noise, it's my computer fan. So I do apologize. I cannot do anything about that. As long as you can hear me okay. So yes, we're moving forward on the subdivision and land development ordinance updates, and those are progressing. And like I said, it should only be a few more months until those are wrapped up and ready to go. So I'm hoping that will have a quick resolution when that is done. Otherwise, we did just sign a new 3-year contract with MCPC that became effective January 1st of this year. So I just wanted to thank Narberth again for entrusting your planning services to the County Planning Commission. And we look forward to continuing our relationship with the borough. Todd, you're still muted.
Is that it, Maggie? Anything else?
I suppose I can go ahead and give my other update now as well. So on a personal note, tonight is actually going to be my last Planning Commission meeting with Narberth Borough. I have taken a new position with a new company and will be leaving Montgomery County Planning Commission as of the end of this month. So on a personal note, while you are continuing your contract with MCPC, it will not be with me for much longer. So I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank you all so very much for being a really engaging planning commission to work with over the past few years. I really appreciate your attention to detail and dedication to the planning process. So it's been a pleasure working with you all, and I wish you all of the best, and look forward to keeping tabs on what's going on in the borough, being a nearby neighbor myself. So looking forward to seeing what happens with that. And again, just wanted to thank you all for all of your coordination over the past few years, and really being great to work with. So it's a really sad and bittersweet moment for me to say goodbye to MCPC, but we will be transitioning into a new planner very soon. I've already talked to Matt West, so we will be coordinating with you over the coming weeks to transition. So we will ensure that there is a continuity of service with our contract, with our existing programs and projects. So you will not hopefully feel any negative impacts of me leaving, but we will be working to transition the new planner into the work program that we have going on with you, to ensure again that we have that continuity, so that you can stay on track with all of the great work that you've been doing. So thank you all very much.
Okay. Well, I was shocked but delighted to hear that news today, Maggie. And myself, I wish you all the best. I'm glad you'll still be in the area. And I don't know whether my planning commission authority allows me to say this, but I think you can have a lifelong visa to re-enter Narberth whenever you want. We'll just wave you through border control.
Perfect. I appreciate that.
We appreciate your diligence too on our behalf, and I know you've given us a lot more than the contract called for, so we appreciate that very much. We'll have to name some zoning provision after you, maybe.
I like the sound of a nice legacy to leave on. That would be great. I appreciate it. Thank you so much, Todd.
Okay, the last thing we'll do under announcements updates, just for the record, after the meeting last month with the applicant for 3 Elmwood, I and the township staff met with them via Zoom to review the comments that came in, and discuss with them what their preferred direction would be. And they very much took the comments that the public made to heart. They're going to reevaluate their project to see how they may be able to adapt it to address the issues that came up. It's important to recognize that some of the issues that came up would be finally addressed at the preliminary plan phase, not the tentative sketch plan phase, but they did agree to look at some of the basic issues in terms of the siting and the density of the buildings. And so we are waiting their signal that they will be resubmitting this. When we met in December, the Tuesday after our meeting, or a week after our meeting, they said, oh, we'll be back in January, which was an ambitious schedule, obviously. So I've heard they may submit their application sometime this month, a new one, I'm not sure. So we'll just have to wait and see how that evolves. But they're going back and assessing. They also did agree, and they will meet with the Short Ridge Civic Association in Lower Merion, which was one of the concerns that the Lower Merion Township commissioners had. So they will be doing that, from what I understand. That is all I have to report on that matter. Does anyone in the commission have any questions about any of those topics? Okay. So we'll move right in then to the main business of the evening. We're grateful to have Corey and Kathleen here to talk to us about how we might, what our next steps might be if we wanted to explore a historic preservation approach to managing change in Narberth as was recommended in the Heritage Action Plan and further recommended by the Narberth Planning Commission last year. Council in November asked us to report on that, and Corey agreed to come to this meeting. Hopefully we can learn more about how the process works, how we get from where we are to where we might want to be, and what our next steps might be, whether they are the development of some of these legislative things we need, whether it's some more public meetings and conversations. Hopefully at the end of this conversation, we'll at least have a little bit better of a picture of what we ought to be doing next. So with that, and for the members of the public, those documents I referred to, the Heritage Action Study, which Corey and Kathleen co-authored and led, and the subsequent report by the Narberth Planning Commission, they are accessible via the website, the borough's website, the page where meetings and meeting materials are listed. Those materials are listed and downloadable there. If that is not, that's difficult for you to do, just email me at narberthplanningcommission@gmail.com, and we will just email you those documents so you can look at them. So with that, Corey, welcome. And Kathleen, welcome again. Thank you for joining us. I will turn it over to you, Corey. I'm actually going to see if I can figure out how to do the screen sharing thing, and then we'll be off.
Great, thanks, Todd. Hi, everyone. Happier New Year to all of you. It's been a little while since I've seen and been with most of you. For those who are not, who have not had the pleasure of meeting and sitting in that upstairs council room with in the past, I'm Corey Kagaris. I'm the Community Preservation Coordinator at the State Historic Preservation Office. I work in the Eastern region, which is 13 counties from Chester on the southwest to Wayne County on the New York border, including Montgomery. So I am here in my cabinet of curiosities at home, like most of you are as well. So assuming that I have the screen sharing ability now,
I believe you do.
I do. What I am going to do here in just a second is go through a discussion of what an ordinance might look like based on the work and the findings that we had come to in the action plan process. What I understand Narberth's goals and to be around preservation, and the kind of paths and vehicles available to you, and the decision points that are available to the borough going forward in terms of what that ordinance might address or not. One of the follow-ups to this meeting will be a transmission of a sample ordinance document that I've been working on for the last few months, partly in response to some of the work that I've done in Narberth, realizing that the path, figuring out what you want is only a portion of the journey. Figuring out then how to actually get that turned into legislation is a whole other process. And I'd say over the last 6 months of my work, I have been contacted by no less than about 12 different municipalities across my counties saying, how do I write one of these ordinances? So that has prompted me to start working on some sample documents, and that would provide prompts for the borough to, or any municipality that would use them, to make the customizations or the tweaks that would be most appropriate to their community in the places where it's possible to make those customizations. So sort of keeping the parts that need to be standardized and sort of untouched in place, and then prompting you to say, here are the things that you can actually modify, change, adapt to your own specific needs. So I will not call these models. They are samples. The legal distinction around that might be very fine, but they are guidance documents that could be used to actually put something in place in Arbor. I'm going to share those with Maggie as your planning consultant, and then the county will share those around to the commission as a result. But I wanted to give you all a kind of a walkthrough how these documents will be structured, so that you understand what you'll be looking at when it gets there. So let me go ahead and get started here.
Yay.
All right, that worked. All right. Some of what I'm going to share will be a bit of a refresher for some of you, and but I want to make sure that everybody's sort of having the same conversation and is at the same point in the conversation as we go along. So I'll just sort of recap a couple of highlights here. So just a reminder that when we talk about a preservation program at the local level, what we're trying to really accomplish are creating opportunities to manage the nature and the pace of change to a historic environment by providing some intervention and decision points that other tools and processes don't necessarily give you. And those intervention points are put there for a very specific purpose, which is to preserve the history, the heritage, the character of the community. It also should create opportunities for public involvement in certain decisions that affect that character. And effective programs provide clear guidance to both property owners and the decision makers about what those expectations and processes are. I am a big stickler and proponent on pulling no punches and making and avoiding surprises. I believe that the landmines that go off in communities around these types of issues largely become are a result of kind of mismanaged expectations or unclear processes about and guidance around what is supposed to happen and what is not supposed to happen. So I want to really you will see as you start to review some of these sample guidance. It is specific in ways that some existing ordinances that you might find in other communities are not, and that's for very intentional reasons. So I'm going to talk about kind of the three components of the sort of three policy components of a preservation ordinance here, or a preservation program, starting with an ordinance, and then just briefly the other two sort of supporting pieces, guidelines and rules of procedure. Just sort of an ordinance of any stripe has the purpose of establishing the scope and the procedures for designating and managing those changes to historic resources, identifying the activities that require review and approval by the local government and the factors that you're allowed to consider when making those reviews, and the criteria that the decision makers have to use when evaluating those applications. And then it should authorize the development of guidelines that are used in the evaluation of individual applications, as well as on the adoption of those rules and procedures. Now, To take a step back for a minute, Pennsylvania's kind of legal structure around local ordinances is unique nationally because we have not one but two enabling laws that municipalities can look to for legal authorization to put ordinances in place, which has its advantages and disadvantages. So the first is, and those paths are largely, those vehicles largely bifurcate around whether you're trying to address individual resources or districts. So the two tools are, and the two legislative options are the municipality's planning code, which is the larger piece of state legislation that addresses planning and zoning laws at the county and local level, as well as the Historic District Act, which is its own standalone piece of legislation that, as the name implies, is applicable for districts only, would not be available for individual resources, and lays out a more prescribed process and some requirements for doing the kinds of managing the kinds of changes to physical fabric, materials, certain features, as well as whole-scale demolition and new construction in those designated historic districts. So if we're talking about individual resources, the only tool that's available in Pennsylvania is this municipality's planning code enabled zoning overlay. That's not something we identified as a priority in Narberth, where we realized that the whole was greater than the sum of its parts. So we kind of moved away from that, that individual resource approach that you might see in some, particularly townships where there aren't a lot of kind of clearly identifiable clusters or settlements, like districts that we might define as districts, and they're sort of doing more sort of the house over here and the farm over there kind of resource management. So when we talk then about what type of tool could, what we're trying to accomplish in a district, it comes down to what do you want to do within that district, which helps provide some direction on which tool and which legislation is most appropriate. And the distinguishing factor for me is often whether a municipality desires the ability to deny demolition, not just delay it, not just talk about it, not just dance around it, but do you desire the ability to say no and withhold approval for a demolition permit? And if the answer to that is yes, then the overwhelming and sort of undeniable option in my mind is the Historic District Act as the firmest sort of legal foundation. That act has the law also has the ability to give you the tools to manage details around specific alterations. If what you're trying to do is have maybe a lighter touch of regulation, provide certain types of zoning or development-based incentives or relief, setback relief for historic buildings, certain special conditional use opportunities, or really just deal with the sort of form and overall compatibility of new construction, then the zoning overlays via the planning code, municipality's planning code, are a more viable option. The distinguishing factor here is that the Historic District Act has 50 years of appellate level case law in Pennsylvania, upholding a municipality's right unequivocally to deny demolition. It is all tested all the way up through the state Supreme Court, as well as based on some U.S. Supreme Court law that applies to laws of similar ordinances in different states. The municipality's planning code, despite having managing the word demolition in one of its purposes, in the purpose statement for the broad MPC law and zoning law, gives no real structure, specificity, or process for dealing with demolition as the province of zoning. Zoning typically deals with use and overall form and bulk issues, and awkwardly addresses either the very detail-oriented aspects of historic preservation or the big picture demolition issues that preservation ordinances also are also addressing. And the MPC creates some unintentional awkwardness and conflict with other processes that are within zoning. This will become sort of a little more apparent as I talk through the rest of this sample ordinance structure, but I will just kind of reinforce that from a legal perspective, there is a much firmer foundation for a municipality who wants to say no to demolition in a concentrated area via the Historic District Act, even if that's the only thing they use the law to address, and they never talk about individual features or materials around a building. It's a stronger legal path than the more ambiguous zoning route. That being said, you will find places that do this and have ordinances that are based off of the MPC. I will not. I don't want to discuss any other communities' ordinance, particularly in a public setting like this. But I also can't, in good conscience, suggest that anybody else follow those paths either. So I'm going to tell you what I think the best approach for a community like Narberth to do these kinds of things is going to be. So moving on. The second component, we'll come back to the ordinance in a minute. The second component is looking at design guidelines, which are kind of a separate document. They're illustrated and a combination of words, pictures, and drawings that clearly show what how to make whatever alterations that require approval in a way that can get to a yes. So how do you, if you need an approval from the borough to modify the roof line on a building within the historic district, what are the ways that you could effectively modify that roof line and still get to a yes? And what would not be permissible in that way? And then the third component is rules of procedure or bylaws. How do we actually go about the process of and how do we treat people and applicants in a procedurally fair and consistent manner, so that nobody feels like they got kind of raked over the coals or given a free pass in either respect. So to go back to the overarching ordinance, there are four basic functions of a preservation ordinance in this context. Defining what can be considered historic, what are the criteria and the process for designating resources or areas as historic. What types of activities within those designated areas require some type of review and approval? Who gets to make those decisions around approval and approvals? And what are the factors that those decision makers are allowed to consider when making those approvals? So those are the four big tasks that an ordinance needs to cover. So the sample ordinance that I will be sharing with you, it is enabled by the Historic District Act, and it goes through a couple of those. It addresses all four of those points by establishing a criteria and a process for designating historic districts, as well as then subsequently amending the boundaries if you wanted to add area or decrease the boundary, or just simply, clarify the edges or change without changing sort of the net area. You would have a clear process delineated in that ordinance. That's something that actually most ordinances on the books don't do. Currently, they were written in most historic district ordinances that you'll find out there are written in a really static fashion. This is the district, will only ever be this district, it's only ever this big. And inevitably, at some point you come along and say, but I want to add this block, or we want to take this block out. How do we do that? Well, you don't have the words on the books to do that. So this will provide that clarity. This also establishes a board or commission to review those changes and make those recommendations, and require the receipt of certificates of appropriateness for demolition, new construction, and certain alterations to existing buildings. We'll talk a little bit about what can be in that sort of last category of alterations here in a second. So this sample is going to establish a process for the borough to follow to designate one or more districts. Narberth is a pretty small, geographically small and compact community. So we talked through early on the possibility of having multiple small districts in discrete pockets of the community. Ultimately, that's probably not the path I would recommend for you, just given the kind of administrative complexity that can create. But the language would exist for that possibility. There's no harm in doing it. It's a sort of the same thing. You just make some of these words plural instead of singular. The district or districts would need to meet at least one of the criteria that's specified in this sample, and then go through a specific public vetting process that would result in sort of culminate in having the Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission certify those boundaries as the law requires. As a side note, that last step is kind of an anachronism in the law. It's something that we are required to do, but we've greatly modified the process, our requirements and our policy around that last year to make it much more responsive to what the community wants those boundaries to be, rather than our commission or agency telling you what those boundaries have to be. So you will see as you look at the certification policy that what we're asking you to do is say, tell us what you want, tell us that it passes a reasonable level of thought and scrutiny having gone into it, and we will want to say okay, rather than a more sort of directive version of the way this law was applied decades ago. That was a very intentional change. So the second facet of this is then who are the decision makers? Well, the law requires the appointment of a board or a commission. Now there's a four-letter word, or sort of there's a four-letter word in this context that can be perceived as a drawback. What the term the law uses is a board of historic architectural review. What most places call that is a historic architectural review board. I'm going to suggest that I don't care what you call it. I don't care if you call it a preservation commission, a heritage commission. I would not call it, the trash commission, but something of some other more progressive name for that body that would be tasked with not just the review functions associated with the approvals that are required, but taking on some of those bigger planning and educational and outreach tasks that are contemplated in the action plan as well. I take a rather expansive view of what I think that board can and should be doing beyond just sort of the narrowly defined review function that the law gives it. There's no reason you can't sort of give some additional jobs to that group. And again, we'll talk in just a minute about the ways that you can make the work of that group, of that board, more efficient. So here are some of the, there are some professional qualification requirements specified in the law: an architect, a realtor, and a building inspector, and at least 2 other members of the public. Those are written into the state law. And I will acknowledge that composition as something that some communities struggle to fill. It's not a path, having gotten to know Narberth a little bit, I believe that you would have access to the professionals you would need to serve in those roles. I would not have recommended this path if I didn't think you had those kinds of that kind of capacity in your community. But we can talk a little bit about what the implications are for not having all of those roles represented at all times. But I would suggest that what we're looking for are 5 people to talk about and make decisions and apply some discretion to certain situations. And then the law makes this board advisory to the governing body. So the Borough Council is the ultimate arbiter of an issuer of the certificates of appropriateness. This is not dissimilar from the role that a council might play in certain land development decisions based on recommendations from the Planning Commission. So the last point I want to make here is in the sample, there's going to be a provision for the board, for that review board or commission and the council to approve certain projects that could be reviewed what we'll call administratively by staff or consultants after the adoption of some guidelines. So there is a way to kind of modernize the way that these ordinances have been structured and administered over the years by kind of grabbing some, instituting a process that lets low-level, reasonably quantifiable and kind of routine projects to be approved over the counter, and then creating kind of an accountability feedback loop where those decisions get reported back to the board and ultimately to council, so that both the board and the council can focus on the things that actually matter, and not waste a lot of time and energy doing reasonably mundane things on a monthly basis. That's where I think a lot of people feel like they get value here. So just to, this is sort of the meat of the whole thing. So if you pay attention to nothing else, here's a couple of slides for you to think about. This is all structured around what actually gets reviewed and what requires approval. So we start off with the concept that all the regulated activities that are specified in the ordinance are going to require a certificate of appropriateness. It's again sort of a term of art that is baked into the law, but let's go with that. So before you can do something that's on this list, you have to get a COA. You can't get a zoning or a building permit for that activity if one is required for that activity until you have the certificate of appropriateness. That's important because that helps to put a stop or sort of deal with the building permit, the clocks that are built into the Uniform Construction Code around building permits, which require code officers to issue residential and commercial building permits on very specific 15 or 30-day clocks. But the way that I've phrased this ordinance is the COA for that activity is sort of a part of the application package that for that building permit. And so you can't have the permit application be considered complete until you have the COA. So that gives the code officer a little bit of breathing room to allow this process to play itself out if it's not an activity that can be approved kind of over the counter along with that building permit. There are certain things that might appear on this list that don't require building or zoning permits that may still require certificates of appropriateness. But the COAs are only required for whatever things that are on the list that may be visible from a public way. So if you can't see it from the street, it's not something that requires review under this ordinance. That's a limitation placed on this law by the state. It's pretty common in other laws too, other state enabling laws in different states. So. Other important sort of structural components, resources within the districts would be categorized as either contributing or non-contributing. I think this is a pretty standard distinction that most people make, or intuitive distinction that most people make, saying, well, that's sort of a newish building, and so I don't necessarily care about all of the things that might happen to it the way that I would that old building next to it. Including whether it might be demolished or not. What I do care about if that non-contributing building is demolished is what goes back in its place. So in this construct, all contributing buildings require COAs for all activities that are on the list, whereas non-contributing buildings might require a COA for fewer things. Because while I don't necessarily care about the same level of detail when that is non-contributing buildings, there are things that might happen to it that would affect the overall streetscape. An addition, for example, might or adding a story or certain fenestration changes might have an impact that the borough would be interested in having a hand in guiding. And again, all of that's over and above what would be permissible by under the form-based zoning. So in this category, in the category of things that require review, again, in the sample, which can be debated and modified, non-contributing resources could be demolished without a certificate of appropriateness. Again, we don't necessarily care if that thing, that non-contributing building disappears from the landscape, but we do really, what we are concerned about is what might replace it. contributing buildings might would require a certificate of appropriateness for demolition. And again, this law creates the COA as a condition on getting the building permit required to execute the demolition. And that is another distinction between the municipality's planning code, which, demolition is typically the province of the building codes, not zoning codes. So it's sort of a messy fit to try and use the zoning code to prohibit demolition in that same way. The certificates of appropriateness for demolition, again, would be for contributing buildings, would only be issued under the following circumstances. Economic hardship, that's a constitutional issue that kind of has to be there. And there are some specific criteria spelled out on the sample about and definitions for what constitutes economic hardship and how you determine it and what the factors of that are. If the building poses some imminent threat to health or safety, or if its demolition would be determined by the borough to be in the public interest. That term is purposefully not defined in this ordinance, because I think that's something that you would need to figure out what that means in the context of your own community. In the category of major alterations, this is where you get to decide really what it is you want to do. So many of the existing ordinances you will see use very few words and very non-specific terms like alterations to sort of sweep up any change to a building within the designated district and requires a COA for that, for that change. And what I'm here to sort of proselytize and evangelize to you is this legislation can be used to implement a whole effective range of ordinance types, not just that very traditional roofs, windows, doors, all details type of sort of regulatory program. You can use this law and the structure that it provides and the kind of the legal support that it has to deal just with demolition, or just with demolition and new construction, or a very narrow range of things that of changes to existing buildings that you might that stop short of all of the detail management, but do still address some of the big picture character altering changes that are made to individual buildings. I have a series of worksheets that accompany that sample document that you would use to then sort of Chinese menu pick off the things and say, I want this, we want to do this and this and this, and we want to do this for contributing buildings, but not for non-contributing, to craft a very specific scope, regulatory scope for this ordinance. So what you see in the sort of the sample is going to be all of the things that sort of fall on this list, but I want you to understand it as being as a starting point that you could use to go through and scratch things off, or borrow from other lists to really craft the scope that is appropriate for what your community will tolerate and what they need. And then new construction, we distinguish between both principal buildings and accessory buildings. As I've said to you for a very long time, Narberth's codes is more sophisticated than most other communities in the Commonwealth. So you will need to think, carefully about how to marry terms in this ordinance with what's in your zoning, and really decide what is already addressed in your form-based zoning that you don't need to worry about here. So, and that's where that again, that's sort of that menu of options can come in handy, because you can say, well, we need to do this, but not this, because that's already handled in some other piece of our program. And then finally, the other components I think that you're going to be looking at are as implementation tools after the ordinance is adopted, include design guidelines, these rules of procedure, and then these administrative review guidelines, where from that list of regulated activities, if you choose to go with a some level of alterations included in that scope, you could pick off of there the things that would be pretty easy, and you could give pretty tight guidance to a staff person or a designated consultant to approve over the counter without having to go on a monthly meeting agenda, and drag out over several months, as long as there's then this sort of regular reporting and feedback loop. Now, to get from here to there eventually, what I am recommending, and what Maggie's going to talk to you about in just a second, is decoupling the conversation around what I will call the text ordinance from the map ordinance. So to borrow terms from the zoning process, the sample that I'm going to share with you would allow council to would allow the planning commission ultimately to sort of make the customizations and provide council with a structure that could be adopted, independent of designating a district, so that you have the tool and the process on the books to create a district, which would be a major step forward. The reason I recommend that approach is because I've seen, including in NARBOR's own past, the fate of the process be tied to and ultimately go up in flames around disagreements over the boundaries. And so you have lost then the ability to create any district, no matter what size or specific configuration, because the specific boundary that was proposed was controversial or lacked support in certain areas. So I wanted to give you a tool that lets you give yourselves the ability to create districts independent of creating the district itself. And so the district itself would then be the next step. Once you get that process on the books, you could then begin the public engagement and the honest discussion around where that boundary should actually be applied. So let me stop that. I had all of your windows minimized, so I couldn't see if any of you had disappeared or had your eyes closed. So I'm glad to see you're all still here. Maggie, do you want to go to your part next, and then I guess we'll do discussion questions? Okay.
That's fine. Go ahead, Maggie. Maggie, you should be able to share your screen.
All right, Corey, were you planning on sharing? Why don't you share your screen and I'll talk through you.
Yep, I got it.
And again, I apologize. My computer has now decided to ramp up. Are you still able to hear me fine over the fan noises? I'm going to assume that's a yes. Okay. So Corey just described the kind of process for what would go into an actual ordinance, and looking at all of the different ways it can be hyper-tailored to specific goals for the municipality. I wanted to take a step back a little bit and look at it from a broader process perspective in terms of kind of getting from point A to point B, because there are steps that we would need to take to go through the process. So right now we're at just a basic preliminary discussion stage through all of the work that Corey and Kathleen had done with the creation of the Heritage Action Plan. It has been determined the best course of action is to go through the process under the Act 167, the Historic District Act, as opposed to the 247 Municipalities Planning Code. So Corey, if you want to advance to the next slide. So this is kind of a basic rundown of kind of point A to point B. We don't have specific timelines in here for how long certain things should take, but a couple of things to consider. So the whole presentation that Corey gave about what goes into the ordinance is summarized here in the step where it just says draft an ordinance. So this is where, to go along with the recommendation to decouple the text itself, the language of the ordinance, from the determination of the mapped boundary area, the first step would be to go through the process of taking that sample ordinance language that Corey has created and tailoring it to the goals of the borough in terms of what gets included for review and how all of that happens. The next thing would then be to adopt the actual ordinance. So just as with any ordinance, it would go before council for adoption and meet all of the public advertising. This is where we can kind of do option A and option B. And so I have a flow chart to kind of summarize what that would look like. So there is the option to do the boundary, so the mapped area and the text, the ordinance language itself, simultaneously. There's an option to do it separately. And again, the previous potential pitfalls that were experienced in the past was that the mapped boundary area and the text itself were so intertwined and nobody could agree that the previous efforts to adopt a historic preservation district or something like that had failed in the past. The hope is that if we do in fact decouple this, then we can write the ordinance to have everybody agree on what should be regulated first. And then we can take a look at if these are the regulations that we have agreed to, where should it apply? So the next step would then be to identify those boundaries. And again, this could happen simultaneously with the development of the language, but it may be more prudent to, again, get the ordinance language written first and then take a look at the boundary district. Corey has suggested that there potentially could be a temporary kind of subcommittee. It could be appointed. They would exist solely to work through this process of identifying the district, and then that entity would be dissolved upon conclusion of the boundary identifications, so that would not essentially be then what would be that border commission that would be created under the requirements of the Historic District Act. Along with those procedural requirements that Corey mentioned earlier, PHMC does have to review and kind of grant approval through the certification process. The 45 days is written into kind of what the law says. Corey has said, though, that there could be, since he is our coordinator for the region, he's able to kind of manage that timeline. So we may have some wiggle room with that. But it's important to note that there is a meeting schedule that PHMC holds. They meet quarterly. And so we would have to time the submission package to the meeting. And I believe the meeting that we would be looking at would be a June meeting, would be the earliest that we could reasonably assume to get all of our materials in order to submit them in time for that meeting. And that's a pretty tight timeline, I would say. Finally, the board or commission, again, the HARB, or again, some other name that you can give to that agency or to that group of people who would be reviewing, would be done after the ordinance is adopted itself. So the formation of the committee, the review committee, is a kind of secondary action that happens after we've gone through this process of writing the ordinance language, and potentially also after the boundary has been identified. Okay, next slide. So the kind of two flow charts that we could look at is to develop the ordinance text. This is always going to be our number one first step. And again, this is taking the sample language provided by Corey. It'll be worked through my office, MCPC, with the Planning Commission. In public meetings, we can discuss this and then target all of those areas that we would like to include in the regulatory process in terms of these are the items that we wish to regulate, taking from that Chinese menu of options that Corey mentioned. This option is if we were to include a boundary simultaneously with the ordinance text. So then we could develop the district boundaries. We would take a look at the borough as a whole. Again, the recommendation is that we have kind of one boundary versus having multiple smaller boundaries. The discussion would then be what that boundary could look like. And again, this is where we could create that temporary interim group to help identify that. And then council will go ahead and adopt both the text of the ordinance language and the boundary at the same time. That documentation could then be sent to PHMC for the certification process. There is a very specific checklist that we have to include, which is pretty straightforward. And then the last step would be to establish whatever review board will then serve as the administrative arm, the non-administration administrative arm of the ordinance that would then make recommendations for certificates of appropriateness. The next option is to decouple, again, that boundary definition or designation from the ordinance language itself. So again, we start off with developing the ordinance language. Council goes ahead and adopts the text ordinance by itself. We don't have a boundary yet, but that's fine. The next step would then be to take a look at those district boundaries. So at this point then, we have the ordinance in place, the language, and again, this is where we've identified and all agreed upon and adopted the language that says that we would like to regulate these activities. And then we look at the boundary itself. Council adopts the boundary, and then we proceed with the same process. So we take that and apply for our certification through PHMC. And then again, our board is established as our reviewing agency. So those are kind of our two options for the process. There's a couple other resources that the State Historic Preservation Office has given us to develop the ordinance itself. We've already kind of started doing some of this. One of the recommendations is to form a study committee or a task force to consult with BA SHPO to facilitate public engagement, draft the ordinance, gather other materials. This is what we're doing. So MCPC, the Planning Commission, and then Kathleen is assisting us, and we're obviously coordinating with Corey, who is our preservation coordinator. So he is well aware of all of this information and has been to the borough many times and knows what's on the ground. And then there's just the steps that they lay out in terms of adopting the ordinance. And then once the ordinance is adopted, then we have to do the certification process. So next slide. Again, here's our 45 days. So this is pulled directly from the state's website. So you have to submit that certification checklist. And so this is where I was mentioning that these meetings are held quarterly. So we have March, June, September, and December. And like I said, I don't think that we're going to be able to get our materials in time for submission for the March deadline or for the March meeting. But June would be kind of the earliest that we could potentially look at. Otherwise, we're looking at September, and then December would be the latest in this year that we would be able to get the historic office to certify the boundary. But again, the historic preservation ordinance itself, or whatever ordinance we write, can and should be adopted first. So again, just working backwards from that, kind of what that would look like. And again, I believe that our target deadline should be the June meeting, depending on how quickly we're able to get through the ordinance and boundary identification. So those are going to be our two options. Again, the recommendation from Corey is that we do in fact decouple those two things. So we'll work on the ordinance first, and then we can pursue the boundary identification. And I think that would help us to focus our energies on not thinking about, what regulations we're applying to which areas, but just which regulations do we feel are important to include in this ordinance, and then understand what areas are going to be impacted and regulated by those regulations that we've agreed to, and kind of work into it that way. So I'm going to mute myself because I hear my computer ramping up again, but happy to take any questions.
Sorry there. Thank you both. Thanks, Corey. Thanks, Maggie. That was a ton of information, but I found it was extraordinarily well organized and hopefully easy to kind of follow the path that is in front of us as you described it. What I'd like to do is I'll just entertain any question that members of the Planning Commission have at this point. There are a number of members of the public. What I would ask is if you have questions right now, why don't you type them up into the chat, and then we can try and weave those in to the conversations that the questions that the planning commissioners have. We can also set aside time at the end for direct public questions as well. So with that, I'll just ask if anyone on the commission has any questions they would like to ask. Jim.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Is my mic on?
We can hear you.
Yes.
Okay. What point are we going to decide and discuss and decide whether we are after the ability to deny demolition permits and or any other coercive aspect of facade alterations? Like, when are we going to have that conversation? Because I don't feel like we've had it, and I don't feel like we've received a directive yet from council. And I feel like a discussion is necessary.
Jim, are you asking when in this process would we tackle that topic, or when would we have some sort of interaction with the council to get direction from them?
Well, so yeah, the presentations just now mentioned a number of decision points where we would, we would head down one path if we decided. One of the earliest decision points was whether we want the ability to outright deny demolition permits. So that's a pretty basic question that I don't know that we have even touched. So that being one of the earliest questions, I feel like we should start deciding these things, or at least talking about them, and then taking those turns on the decision point chart.
Well, Jim, we discussed what our goals would be for even talking about this topic, or for what a preservation approach could accomplish. And I think it was pretty clear, in 2019 when we talked about this from September through December, and in the report that we finished in January, that one of our key goals was to give the borough the ability to, you use the word deny, I use the word manage, but I think they wind up being the same thing, which is give the borough the ability to review and disapprove or approve of demolition permits. And that was one of the key things I think we stated as a policy goal already. I think secondarily we stated as policy goal the review of major alterations or new construction, but as to what that would entail, we weren't quite as clear at that point. So I feel like that at least among the commission members, I can't say that in any way, shape, or form reflects anything council may or may not be thinking about, but at least in terms of commission, I think that was a pretty clear outcome of our conversations.
Okay, how can I phrase it a different way then? So
Sure.
one of the earliest phrases in Corey's presentation was that part of the objective is about managing the pace of change within the borough. And I was wondering what is an acceptable pace of change within the borough? I did a little looking into this over the last month or two, and I have found out that there have been about 160, somewhere between 160 and 180 residential house sales within Narberth over the last 5 years, and there have been 3 teardowns. And if that's a measure of a pace of change that we're currently undergoing, what are we after? Are we after a lower pace of change than 3 out of 160? I know it would be lovely if nothing ever got torn down, that everything just stayed the same, and we always saw the same houses forever and ever. But I think we have to acknowledge that teardowns do serve a purpose at times. They rejuvenate housing stock. They do away with potentially the housing that's no longer wanted or that's no longer viable. There are certain environmental benefits to new construction, and the modest pace of 3 out of 160 over 5 years is, I'm not sure where we're trying to get to from that. So if we're in the process of tuning a historic preservation ordinance to a more desirable pace of change, what is that pace of change that we're after? I think is a question we need to answer.
So essentially, you're trying to ask. I'm not sure if you're trying to make the argument, but you're at least saying the question should be asked: is the, just assuming the numbers you've given us are correct, is that really such an unacceptable pace of change that we should be bothering with this at all? Is that your question?
Yeah. I mean, there are other aspects to it as well. I mean, I could go into the 3 houses that were torn down. There are some things that are similar about them. They tend to be on the smaller side. Maybe they have deferred maintenance issues, or something else about them that doesn't make them saleable on the real estate market. And if those are the houses that we're targeting with the entire force of a historic preservation ordinance, we're also targeting a certain class of owner. I would argue, someone who's lived in a house a long time, who wants to move out and wants to realize the value of their house. And if they find it's unsaleable, then we're asking them to take on the cost of maintaining their house to a saleable condition, or to lower the price to the range of a fixer-up or something. So I guess the overall question of what are we after with a historic preservation ordinance when it comes to residential housing, if we're essentially targeting this towards 3 houses within the scope of 5 years, 3 owners, that's a lot of ordinance bearing down on just a small handful of people, and I feel like we should tread carefully on that.
So Jim, let me suggest that's like the core policy question here. That your original question was, when would we talk about that? because I don't, what I'd like to do is while Kathleen and Corey are on the phone, or at least in our meeting, I mean, I think these policy questions, like the one you raise, are for us to debate. They're for council to debate. And while we have Kathleen and Corey on the phone, I just like what the map should include is another big question. What I'd like to do is sort of make sure we use their time to kind of understand the mechanics of this and the path. So I would say the time to talk about this is when we actually talk about what an ordinance might do, which would be the next time we talk about this. The next time we talk about this would be about what goes into an ordinance. So I don't mean to say your question isn't important, because I think your question is the elemental question here. Because if you can take your question and say, well, that's really not such a big deal, 3 houses over so many years, then maybe this isn't needed. But for tonight, I hope you'll accept that we can talk about that at a future meeting when we talk about the ordinance, and kind of use Corey and Kathleen's time to just talk about the state law and how a process like this would work, if that's okay with you.
Yeah. Okay.
But I mean, that would be noted, and I know you're not going to forget it.
Okay. Why don't you move on to someone else, and maybe I'll come up with some nuts and bolts questions.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Are there other questions from anyone on the commission?
Yeah, I just have a quick procedural question. Maggie, and we're all, I'm sure, it's unanimous that we're all sorry to see you go. But what are the practical implications of your leaving in terms of this effort?
So like I had mentioned, we have a number of other staff members who are fairly well versed in the creation of a historic ordinance. So there are other people who are able to step in rather seamlessly. I think that could help with this particular effort. The news is quite new to my office, so we haven't had a chance to formalize yet what the transition process will be. But my staff will work with the borough to ensure that that transition is as smooth as possible. So the person who will be taking over from me will have all of the available resources and will step in kind of exactly where we are in this process. So whatever I would have ended up doing, they should be able to do as well. And again, based on the timeline that the borough would like to achieve, that can maintain as the priority level to ensure that we don't get behind because of me leaving and the transition that has to happen.
Okay, thank you. We're still going to.
Thanks, Dave. I'm going to miss all you too.
Dave, I'll just add to that. Montgomery County has become my new hot zone in the last year. So I'd say in the last year to 18 months, I've had a chance to work with a half a dozen of Maggie's colleagues. So I'm from my perspective, I'm confident whoever ends up getting assigned to Narberth's work from this point forward is somebody that I probably had a chance to interact with. So I think that relationship would be fine. It's, however, it works out with the borough itself, and that's a different question, but.
Yeah, thank you.
Jim Cornwell Hyde, do you have any questions?
I have a quick question. Corey, did you say you had a sample ordinance that you were going to share with us?
Yes. I've got 20 pages of sample ordinance to send your way. And I wanted to wait to do that until after we had this conversation, so that again you could sort of look at those pages with what I've just shared and kind of structurally in mind, because legislation gets a little numb.
So does that ordinance include basically your recommendations for Narberth, which you seem to imply you had?
Yeah. So there's just to sort of broaden out a minute. I mentioned, thinking about ordinances on a spectrum, from the sort of very lightest touch of dealing just with demolition all the way up to dealing with all of the details. And based on the conversations from, and the outcomes of that action plan, Narberth seems to fit somewhere in the middle of that. Now that could go, that could skew a little bit in either direction towards the lesser restrictive or the more or the more full scope, depending on what you sort of choose off that list. So there are actually kind of multiple ordinances in this sort of toolkit that I'm building. You're going to get the kind of middle version that again addresses all of those categories of changes on there, with the understanding that you would then take that as sort of an opening bid. So this body can go through there and say, yeah, we like this, but we don't think we should do this, or we want to borrow this thing off of this other list that isn't on here yet, or in the case of the circumstances under which demolition might be considered, you could amend those factors, add additional issue things. So again, it's sort of an opening point that would give you probably 90% of the words that you need, and help to focus the remaining 10%, your effort on the remaining 10% of the things that you actually, have some choice and some that have some consequence to what you're going to do, than trying to sort of grab bag from a whole bunch of other places.
Okay. Yeah, I think Justin, I do want to make a quick response to what Jim was saying, Jim Spear was saying. I think we have to plan for the future. I mean, whatever has happened in the past, I don't think we're not, right now, we seem to be I feel a bit of a crisis with some of the construction that's going on. I don't know when those 3 houses that have been replaced were demolished, but it seems to me they've been relatively recent. Is that right, Jim? I mean, I don't think we can say just because there were only 3 in the last 5 years and there've been a whole lot of sales without it. I think we're at risk just by the nature of the new houses that are going up in place and the cost of the sales of those houses.
Are there other questions for Corey or Kathleen?
Yeah, I have a question, Todd. Corey, knowing our zoning code as well as you do now, do you foresee areas of conflict between the ideal preservation ordinance and the existing zoning code? And I guess what that boils down to is if the ideal preservation ordinance, maybe I'm using the wrong term, were to suddenly appear, are there areas of the zoning code that would want to be revised?
So the interesting thing about your zoning code is, and many of you have heard me say this before, you particular, is the form-based zoning addresses a lot of the issues that most other communities rely on their preservation ordinance to deal with. So what Narberth has done effectively through the implementation of this form-based zoning is to take a lot of the put a lot of the thought and effort into the particularly the new construction realm that in the zoning code, which is something that communities with more standardized sort of Euclidean zoning and traditional zoning codes rely on their historic district ordinance to try and address. And by that point, it's almost too late, So Narberth gives you a better box to start from. What you lack, and I think what your experience has shown you, and at least as I've sort of heard either anecdotally or sort of third hand, is as that code has started to be implemented and you started to see some new developments come online under that code, there might be a desire to be able to look at some more details in particular properties that the zoning code doesn't let you doesn't give you the get down into, particular material choices, or maybe the organization of certain fenestration, not just sort of the percentages, but how does that actually, how do those windows actually lay out on a particular facade? And so if you so chose, you could you could craft this ordinance to let you further refine that box, sort of the details on that box, which is already sort of, again, better than most places have are starting from. So are there things about your zoning code that I think that would need to be reworked in order to make to fit better with this preservation ordinance? I would say that I think your challenge is there's nothing that comes to mind off the top of my head to that degree. And I think what you have the opportunity by doing this the way that you have, I think the opportunity Narberth has is to craft a much more specific and responsive preservation ordinance than what you'd seen, that fills those particular gaps in the zoning code that you've been able to identify. Does that make sense? I might be sort of overplaying that, but
well, I will say that when we conceived of the zoning code, the idea of a preservation ordinance was not on the radar. It had been many years ago, but the idea had been abandoned. So many of us who worked on the zoning code tried to build into it many of the features that we naively imagined would be in a preservation ordinance, having to do with the form. That was the idea of the form in the form-based zoning. So whether the existing code can comfortably coexist with a preservation ordinance, I presume the answer is yes, but that coexistence is something that I've thought about a little bit as we've tiptoed our way into to where we find ourselves now.
Well, again, as became apparent, a couple of years ago through that planning process, what your zoning code does effectively is ensure that whatever gets built in Narberth looks more or less like what's in Narberth. Now, more or less. There'd be some deviation, but that's sort of understood and acceptable. What it doesn't do really well is deal with the kind of existing buildings, to either making sure that they survive or don't get irreparably altered, having those big turrets on Windsor Avenue ripped off, which the zoning code would have nothing to say about. So if there are elements of the existing building stock that you think are particularly character defining and would be really hard pressed to imagine Narberth being without, then those are the things that I think you could put on that menu of this is the stuff we need this ordinance to do for us in addition. So that's the sort of the beauty and the opportunity of what I hope this sort of very itemized structure will allow you to do, is to let you say, I want to define a very narrow range of things that we think this ordinance needs to cover that our other codes don't, rather than just sort of a blanket saying, well, this will just cover everything else, and we'll just sort of deal with the details later. That I think just gets too overwhelming and duplicative. And I think where you run into problems is when you have two laws trying to do effectively the same thing. So if you can spend a little bit of time in conversation with each other saying, this already, we've already got a code that does this, so we don't need this other one to do it too. I think that will serve you all very well. There was a question in the chat about the, going back to that, the two legislative vehicles, the Historic District Act and the zoning the zoning code. So, and which one is, what are the sort of pros and cons of using particularly the zoning overlay or the MPC to do these things. And it is true, there are a number of municipalities. The exact number is not quite known. It's somewhere in the low hundreds of communities in Pennsylvania that have enacted some form that have utilized the zoning authorities in the municipality's planning code to create a preservation ordinance. Don't know the exact number because there's no reporting mechanism to my office, so we don't have sort of a census that we keep. That number was assembled by a research team from Shippensburg University a couple of years ago. And because there's no structure written into the municipality's planning code about how to use zoning for preservation, there are potentially kind of infinite options for how that could show up in a zoning code. So it's hard to kind of pick out in discrete, clauses from different ordinances to say, oh, these are all doing sort of the same thing. What makes what you'd see in those situations is the communities that utilize those ordinances the MPC based ordinance most often tend to be townships, and they tend to be communities that have used it for individual resources, sort of scattered around a landscape, not in a concentrated setting, because that's the only legislative option available to them. Unfortunately, the legislature is not doing anybody any favors in this regard. So it's a tool of necessity because it's what's available. What makes it awkward? It's an awkward fit for trying to deal with the demolition question for a couple of reasons. What Chapter 6 of the Municipalities Planning Code says is, in 3 different sentences that are not next to each other, that municipalities can use zoning to protect historic properties. Sometimes historic properties are listed together with agricultural resources, sometimes with natural resources, sometimes places of patriotic interest. So it's sort of a mishmash of ideas. And in theory, that sounds like a very open-ended opportunity that municipalities can use. What makes it awkward is as you read on through that chapter and through the subsequent chapters of the planning code, the law, it gets increasingly more specific about how zoning is to function and what the tools are available to administer a zoning ordinance. So the tools that a municipality has outside of the adopted regulations and the relief from the adopted regulations come in the form of 3: a variance, a conditional use, or a special exception. And the law is very specific around those things. The circumstances under which each of those could be gathered. So then the question becomes, which of those tools is most applicable to granting of a demolition permit? Well, it's not really a special is it a special exception scenario? Is it a conditional use scenario? Those don't sound like the right procedural fits. How do you, the tools that are prescribed in there are meant to address the form and use questions that zoning is traditionally associated with. So when you start to use it for things like managing demolition, you have to beg and borrow different ideas and sort of look hazily through others in order to find the words that you need to and the tools you need to create that. Now, to my knowledge, a community that has used that law to deny a demolition permit, to the extent that those permits have ever been denied, has not been litigated through the appellate court system. So we can't find any court interpretation to flesh out those 3 sentences to say, so these are the circumstances and the tools that by which a municipality can use zoning to deny or withhold a demolition permit. And that's where it gets sort of perilous for me, because I have great concern that particularly in hot real estate markets where it matters a whole lot whether you get this permit or not, and where it might be worth somebody's while to litigate something, I think that's where you're probably going to see some case law, and not structured in an appropriate way. An ordinance that tries to do something it's not really well suited or kind of intended to do puts things on pretty shaky ground. There are some ordinances I've seen that do this in ways that make me really nervous. I've seen some language recently that makes me say, gosh, I hope nobody I hope no lawyers get a hold of this language and a client with a client who's willing to pay for it, because I feel like it will take a judge, a quick minute to find all sorts of equal protection or due process problems with what's being proposed here. So I think from a legal perspective, and I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not giving anybody legal advice. Let me make that part very clear as well. But just from a policy perspective, I don't think that the language inserted into the MPC about preservation zoning as a preservation tool was well thought out or really well intended to enact the regulatory programs that are being contemplated here. I would argue that Narberth is actually using its zoning code to do some preservation work, so it's using its zoning tools to create things like a form-based code, which are also not authorized in there, but you have found ways to creatively apply those rules to preserve the character of a older and historic community. So I'm happy to talk more offline about the sort of the awkwardness of that with anybody who would like. I can put my contact information, in the chat here in a second. But it's the kind of thing that when there's an otherwise sound and good tool available to do the thing you want to do, I would encourage you to look at that first and find until you've decided that it is just really not the thing you need or can do before looking elsewhere.
So I'd like to follow up with that, if I could, actually, by directing a question to Kathleen. It's a two-part question. I mean, our neighboring municipality, Lower Merion Township, has both a district system and a MPC-based system, and it uses its district system for districts, and it uses its zoning system for specific resources. That's correct, right, Kathleen? I'm stating
Right.
Okay. So, but I believe Lower Merion does not have the ability to outright prohibit demolitions. It just can create a stay of demolition. Is that correct?
No, actually, through the Historic District Act and through the zoning code, Lower Merion can prohibit demolition.
So
you have
in
two
regard
classes.
in regard to the zoning code direction then, which applies more to specific resources, then can you talk to us a bit about the dynamics of how that is applied when it comes to demolition situations. I think, one of the question in the chat was, what's the lived experience of communities that have been doing this? And I'm wondering, are some of the things that Corey's talking about in terms of the uncertainty of the legal picture, is that somehow impact the way Lower Merion is able to apply that part of its code?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak for the township. I can speak to my experience with the township. Having lived through the creation of a couple of historic districts, and most recently having celebrated the designation of a dozen or so individual resources under our zoning code. So Lower Merion does use both the zoning and the Historic District Act. We have 7 historic districts in the township and approximately 1,000 individual resources. I think that if you talk to planners in the township and even certain commissioners who understand how this works, the preference would be to have something more like the Historic District Act to protect these discrete resources. If there was something that enabled the township to do that through something similar to the Historic District Act, I think that they would. I think that the one reason that they use the municipalities planning code to create these preservation protections, and there are demolition protections. There's a tiered system in Lower Merion where you would have a class 1 resource, which would get demolition protection. It's the Board of Commissioners who make that decision. And then you have class 2 resources. And the class 2 resources are just given a 90-day stay. And the distinction isn't necessarily, it doesn't necessarily come down to significance. It's more, initially when it was, this system was created, it was to recognize the interest and the desire of some people not to have their resources regulated to the point of demolition. So, Lower Merion has been successful in the last few years in placing additional historic resources on its inventory. But there's always there's always anxiety, I think, in that municipality about whether a challenge will come forth, because I guess back in 2000, when the ordinance was first created that permitted the creation of an inventory and the creation of an historical commission, there were a number of property owners who came forward and contested the elevation of their properties to class 1, which gives the board, as I said, the ability to deny a demolition. And so the board at the time gave those owners the option to have their properties removed. I can't say that they would do that now. A lot of the properties that came forward more recently were really kind of big ticket, public, kind of quasi-public, private, institutional type buildings like the Barnes Foundation and St. Charles Borromeo. Those are kind of in a different category than residential. So, I think debates about public and private debates about demolition are different than when it's a homeowner. But I think that the township has struggled over how to manage its discrete, isolated resources that can't necessarily be pulled into historic districts.
Kathleen, has the township ever used it's you know, the ordinances it's developed under the municipalities planning code. Has it ever used that legislation to block the demolition of a building permanently?
You know, Todd, I can't recall one off the top of my head. I mean, there are always HC meetings where a demolition of a class, I'm trying to think of a class 2, you know, that can't be done because you can only give 90 days.
It would be a class 1.
Right. And so I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but certainly something will probably come to me.
I mean, my recollections when I was on the board of Conservancy is that the township has been reluctant to push its powers too much because it was uncertain of what the legal ramifications might be for the reasons that Corey was saying. A lot of this is sort of untested, and that the fact that the township commissioners in recent years actually designated some class 1 property against the owner's wishes, was that in itself was a landmark decision. So what I'm trying to say is the practical implication, I think, at least from what I understand in Lower Merion, of what Corey is saying is that the township has approached using those powers under the municipalities planning code very tentatively.
Yes, and very cautiously and with a lot of thought as to which resources it would designate, with a team of people and with the consultant, because when these nominations are written, you know, they have to pass muster, especially if they're ever going to be seen in court. And so the resources that the township eventually decided to bring forward for recommendation were, you know, vetted by the historical commission, the planning commission, the board of commissioners, and were whittled down from a group of maybe 35, you know, from a group of maybe 200, and then finally down to 10. And these were the resources that were considered, you know, really highly valuable to the public. Even if they were private, they were considered public assets. And these were resources that the township was willing to take a chance on.
Mm-hmm. And thank you, Kathleen. I'm just pressing this to try to help answer the question of what experience have other municipalities had. And although I know Lower Merion is not a perfect analogy, it's trying to accomplish something different with its use of the municipalities planning code than Narberth would want to accomplish. I think the point I'm trying to make is Lower Merion has been very, very cautious, has worked very gingerly and deliberately, has not been able to use the tool as aggressively as some folks would have wanted, precisely because the legal path has not been kind of blazed through case law.
That's exactly right.
And so I'm trying to draw a line between Corey's warnings about the lack of kind of a legal adjudication of this to his recommendation of how it's practical for municipality to use a tool. Mm-hmm. Hopefully that, although it's only one municipality, helps provide a little bit of real experience as to why that might be. Jim Spear, you
yeah, can I
your hand, but you've been jumping around on my screen from place to place. I don't know how you do that, but
so I have
questions. So I want to make sure we move along, but go ahead.
Okay, so I have a question that just relates to that, which is, so as I understand what you're just saying, that in Lower Merion there are Class 1 and Class 2 historic resource designated buildings, but I can think of a number of buildings that are of pretty significant historic significance, such as the Islamic Center recently. I remember La Ronda. There are a number of buildings that do get demolished in Lower Merion. I don't know whether they were Class 1 or Class 2. But so what we're essentially talking about in Narberth is putting a large number of private residences in the equivalent of Class 1 historic protection. And do I have that right? Like, I'm not sure of the equivalence between Lower Merion and Narberth, but it seems whereas in Lower Merion, larger, more significant, arguably more significant structures do get demolished regardless of their classification as 1 or 2. But in Narberth, we're talking about a potentially large number of private residences, just a blanket getting designated as class 1. Is that right?
Yeah, let me see if I can answer that. So the Islamic Center and La Ronda were both class 2.
Yeah.
So they did not have any demolition protections. But there are smaller neighborhoods within historic districts that don't have La Ronda or Horst Trumbauer kind of houses in them, that you might say have less historic and architectural significance, that would have the equivalent of a class 1 designation, meaning that demolition permit could be denied to them.
So there are houses in Lower Merion right now, just ordinary houses circa 1950 that are under the equivalent of class 1 historic protection?
No, there's nothing like that. There are 7 or 8 historic districts, ranging from just 4 resources in some to, 100 and something in another, and they're not 1950s. These districts were created with a lot of thought that went into creating a narrative about their significance, and they're an assemblage of resources that are united by their architecture or their history or their development over time. So there is that narrative, and they would be considered historic, and their boundaries would reflect that, and that's something that PHMC would be certifying. But these would be considered, if you looked at, for example, the Haverford district, these are humble, more vernacular buildings when you're comparing them to these larger institutional buildings. But it's that assemblage of parts, that's where the whole is greater than the part. And that's what makes them a district. And that's what makes a demolition prohibition important for them.
Has Lower Merion ever denied a demolition in one of its districts?
Only one time, and it's when I sat on the Harb, and that was, those were 2 buildings on Cricket Avenue, and the consensus on the Harb was that the architectural integrity of those 2 buildings was so diminished that they didn't contribute to the district anymore, and that a demolition and redevelopment would actually be a healthier option for that. So I don't think there was much controversy over that. They were buildings that had storefronts that had been so heavily modified that
you approved the demolition, right? In that case,
that was a demolition that was approved.
But the question was, are there cases where you not approved the demolition? And there was one case where you didn't approve a demolition? I guess in the historic district side, when you're acting under the historic preservation in the district, not you, I'm sorry, I'm just projecting here. Has Lower Merion denied demolitions of these modest vernacular homes in its historic districts?
Oh, yes, I think so. I think most people coming forward with applications understand that it's going to be difficult to get a demo approval. So I don't think that there are too many demos that have come forward. But actually recently in the Haverford district, there was, I think, an application for a demo permit, and the Harb and the applicant eventually worked out a compromise where the applicant decided to keep the house, add on to the back, and move it a few feet so that they could accommodate some other development. So it was actually a win for him, and his places are for sale. Yeah.
Can I just jump in here on a couple of points? So I don't want to get distracted by the on the class 1, class 2 situation in Lower Merion, partly because that system is constructed on a set of premises and policies that are not going to ever be introduced here in Narberth. So I don't think that and some of the examples, the sort of the big picture or the big ticket item examples that we were talking about had very specific quirks to them that were going to make them. It just not, that scenario is never going to play out in Narberth. What I want to sort of say that I think the whole goal in structuring an ordinance like this and in the implementation of it is to never really have to say no, because and what you see actually in most Pennsylvania communities, and the reason that there isn't much case law is because it's been set up so that either there's been a mediated solution or the outcome is kind of so clear and the expectation is so clear that you don't really get the ask. So we won't know what number of applications for demolition in Lower Merion's historic districts were denied because they were never applied for, because the circumstance was, the expectation was set that this tool exists to maintain the character, and the expectation is you will maintain the housing stock, and modify it in order to retain, retain its essential form as a start. So I think, in the sample that again, you'll see those 3 very specific conditions as a starting point to say this is when demolition is allowable, because the more gray area that you introduce into that, the more frequently you're going to have this conversation, and maybe you want to have this conversation under certain under other circumstances than what that sample is going to provide for you. But you need to balance that with trying to dice the community into too many small pieces. So one of the issues we talked about during the action plan development was whether a more stratified approach to the district as a whole was something that should be considered. And on the surface, that sounds like sort of a gradation system for the building. Let's just take the residential stuff as a start. And on the surface, that sounds like a good idea and may make some sense. When you start to think about how that actually gets codified and then deliberated and then administered, it gets a little fuzzier, because every time you make a list, it's the first thing people do is trying to get off that list. So, you need to be very clear about what are the distinguishing characteristics between the sort of grade A and the grade B, and the grade B and the grade C, because different rules apply to different grades. So it's not that you can't do that, but you have to be really intentional and be very clear that that there are distinctions to be made, not just and that you can defend them and then clearly administer them. So I know that one of the concerns about this ordinance is it's going to be administratively, what's the impact going to be on the staff and the administrative capacity of the boroughs to do this? So the more distinctions you introduce into this, and the more rules that get layered on or stripped away based on those classifications, the more administratively complex it gets too.
Because of the time, I do want to make sure there was one public question, Corey, which I forwarded to you. Which I think would be important to address, since we want to make sure everyone has a chance to ask the questions they have. The question is, what sort of relief, financial or zoning, will owners of properties receive? I assume that means if a demolition is prohibited, is there some sort of relief that is offered that's commonly, or offered to those who may consider to have a burden, but they can't demolish their building.
So that's one place where zoning, the zoning regulation might and zoning code may actually be is often usually applied. Would those incentives typically come in the form of is and again your form-based zoning may have already addressed a lot of this, are certain uses that aren't available within that underlying zoning classification. So if a building is designated as historic and let's say it's a 5,000 square foot, Queen Anne house that isn't very practical for most single family uses. Maybe if it's designated historic, it could be converted to and utilized as multifamily. You could under a special exception or a conditional use scenario, or you can have setback relief or impervious cover relief if it's designated historic. And retaining the historic building would trip up those calculations in a development scenario. Your church conversion ordinance is sort of an example of an incentive that a development incentive for preservation. So the kinds of incentives that could be developed here may already exist under your standard zoning code in Narberth.
And I'd add, Corey, I'm familiar at least with some larger municipalities that also offer relief, essentially through a negotiated process, to certain kind of dimensional requirements or setbacks if it's necessary, as in the case that Kathleen described, where a house was expanded or moved slightly on a lot to accommodate, I guess, space for another building. I've seen other municipalities provide, waivers or some sort of process by which those kind of dimensional requirements can be adjusted. I've also seen in other municipalities, much larger municipalities, where transfer development rights also were, offered as an incentive for preservation of structures. And I think actually, I don't know, Jim, that we would hit this issue in Narberth, but I know in Lower Merion, it was an issue in Haverford, Kathleen, when the development allowable under the zoning was very inconsistent with the built form of the neighborhood. And there was that inconsistency economically drove a lot of desire to redevelop, which was allowed by the zoning, but so the codes were working at cross purposes there. And so normally when you're writing a preservation code, you're looking to the zoning to make sure that you're not unintentionally through the preservation code trying to codify something which is inconsistent with what the zoning code wants to do. I don't think that's an issue in Narberth because I think the form-based code is pretty much tailored to generating the form that we have. But that, Jim, would be like a box check you'd have to do, to make sure by preventing demolitions you're not working at cross purposes what the code is trying to generate. So there's zoning incentives in terms of dimensional requirements, in terms of use flexibility. Corey, are you familiar with any financial incentives that owners of buildings who are prevented from receiving demolitions, any kind of financial incentives that any municipalities offer?
No, I mean, one of the tricky parts about Pennsylvania is we have this thing called a uniformity clause in the Constitution that has made it difficult for municipalities to try and do any kind of tax relief, local, property tax relief. I used to work in Maryland where there was a law an enabling law that let municipalities provide property tax credits for certain rehabilitation actions or tax abatements to encourage improvement for of dilapidated properties, for more lack of a better term, so that it wouldn't inflate their tax assessment. We don't have anything like that on the books here in Pennsylvania for this purpose, outside of the LRTA or the RETAP legislation, which the real estate tax abatement program, or which is essentially a LRTA for residential properties that municipalities can take advantage of. So, short of that, I don't know of any municipalities that are flush enough with cash to provide direct financial incentives for this purpose, despite their desire to do so.
Yeah, that should be in your slideshow. Pass the hat.
I mean, there've been plenty of ideas about squirreling away and adding surcharges onto certain permits, and creating dedicated funds from certain revenue streams that would provide homeowners for or essentially facade grants. I'd say that the only financial incentives I'm aware of in that regard come through things like the Department of Community and Economic Development, the Main Street and Elm Street facade grant programs. But those are state funds that are applied for and administered on sort of a project level basis, as opposed to sort of ongoing incentive programs.
And there's another question from the public about a recommendation of the comprehensive plan that suggested educational resources be provided to help property owners maintain their homes. So the question is, would that be part of this? I think that I don't know that anyone has discussed that, but I think there are a couple of recommendations like that in the comprehensive plan that would be good for us to keep in mind as kind of a suite of policies. I think Jim Cornwell, you've talked a lot about this, not simply having a stick, but also having a carrot in terms of providing design assistance, or to people who would be inclined to work on rehabilitating their homes if they could find someone to help them navigate that process. So I don't think we should lose sight of that, and there might be other things too. Corey, I think one of the things you're picking up, I mean, the questions about the Historic District Act versus the Municipal Planning Code come from one of our council members. So I think that's something we have to work very hard on, making sure that we have very, very good and thorough investigation of those two policy routes. And it might require some more conversation, I think.
I agree. I would like to address the councilwoman's the quick question about demolition by neglect, because I think that is something that you will see in this sample or addressing the sample ordinance as well. It's a perennial hot button issue. It's a tough one to deal with in this kind of legislation, but here's sort of the broad stroke of how I worked it in here and what it does. So demo by neglect is effectively is essentially a property maintenance code issue, which means which is a subset of the Uniform Construction Code. So it's essentially a building code problem, and state law allows municipalities to adopt property maintenance codes that would address all of the things that demo by neglect typically characterize demo by neglect. Letting holes in roofs exist, and windows fall out, and paint, and walls, fall apart, until it reaches the point where it says, well, I have to tear it down because no reasonable person would invest the kind of money in this building to fix it at this point. So, and that's a pretty common tool that particularly speculative developers use to force an outcome that they might not be able to get otherwise. So because that is essentially a building code, the province of the building code, and all the enforcement tools, meaning the fines and the court proceedings that you need, are in that building code legislation. If your community has not put that code in place, you may not have the tools you need to enforce, like to take somebody to court for those types of violations. So what do you do in the context of this preservation ordinance if you don't have that arrow in your quiver? What I've inserted into this this sample is basically a provision that would allow the community to issue a finding of demolition by neglect under certain circumstances, and it's sort of pretty closely fleshed out, thoroughly fleshed out, that would effectively take that the economic hardship argument off the table for if it came back around for demolition. So by that I mean, just a quick scenario. Somebody buys a house that they would like to tear down, but they know that it's in otherwise good condition, and it's not going to meet any of those the terms spelled out in the ordinance under which demolition permits could exist. There's no demonstrable economic hardship. It's not an imminent threat, and it's not in the public interest to tear it down. So the answer is categorically going to be no. So this person lets the building fall apart until the point where it tips. It would otherwise tip that economic hardship balance. And so now it becomes unreasonable to expect that person to invest in its rehabilitation. But this provision would allow the borough to monitor that property and the sort of declination of that property over time, and issue a finding of economic hardship of demolition by neglect that would make it say, you created the hardship you're now trying to claim. No, that's one of the sort of the seminal rules of zoning hardship, is you can't create the problem that you're now asking the community to bear the solution for. So there's a mechanism built into this that would allow that to be sort of action to be disincentivized in here.
Okay. Because of the time, I'd like to focus on what we might do next. I can think of 3 particular things I think we should focus on. I'd like to suggest, and I'd like to hear everyone else's thoughts about this. The first thing I can think of is Corey will be sending along that that ordinance draft template for us to look at and see how an ordinance might really look. And I think it would be good to ask a couple of planning commissioners to talk that through with Maggie and or Kathleen or Corey, but maybe starting with Maggie while she's still with us, to think about how it does or doesn't suit what we perceive Norberth's needs to be. A second tack I see being important to take is to continue having this conversation in a public manner, potentially a briefing to council sometime very soon. And I think the 2 key issues there potentially are the question Jim raised, which is sort of the policy objective and the urgency of this. And I think there's also sort of the strategic question that Council Member Penanopoulos has been raising about what is the right state enabling authority in which the best state enabling authority under which we should proceed, which actually might also be just something we do as there might be a way to do that as an offline conversation, because it's hugely complex and takes a lot of time and might not be best suited for a public meeting right at the minute. So those are 2 concrete things. I said 3, didn't I? I guess the third was to try to, I wrapped it into the second one, which is to explore that question about the MPC versus the HPA until we are satisfied that one way or the other is the best way to go. With respect, Corey, to your work on this, I'd like to make sure the council members too are on board with 1, the policy questions Jim raised, and 2, the kind of legislative direction that's best for Norberth. So I guess that's what I'm thinking. And so in terms of working with Maggie, I would ask if there's two of you who'd like to volunteer to have a couple calls with Maggie before she leaves and see if you can look at that ordinance and figure out what works and what doesn't for Narberth. Would anyone like to work with Maggie on that? Dave, thank you. Heidi, great. That would be much appreciated. And then I'll follow up with Council Member Pananopoulos to get her advice on not so much on sorting out the issue, but on how we proceed. I'm sorry, the Council President couldn't join us, but I'll follow up with him as well. And then we'll see how it looks next month. Does that sound good? Does anyone have any other recommendations or suggestions? Jim, yeah, go ahead.
I got to unmute. I would like to add, I think Corey mentioned that there may be equal protection concerns with the wording of some types of ordinance, and that's a little concerning to me. And I would like to think that we are not looking for a way around, like an end run around equal protection concerns. And I would like to make sure that we don't inadvertently back ourselves into something that has a disproportionate racial impact. There are concerns that certain types of zoning have inadvertent racial outcomes, and I would not like us to have an equal protection a negative outcome in Narberth, either by design or inadvertently. So I'd like to hear more about that and what the concerns are and how we can avoid them.
Okay. I think that's another policy question, I guess, that we'll have to, because of the hour, Jim, I hope you won't mind. We'll just have to pick that up when we talk about this again.
Yeah, I thought that would be on the list of things in the future. I don't want an answer right now, so okay. I'm sure it's a longer answer. Yeah.
Jim, you're just talking yourself into more and more of these meetings, all the issues you want us to work on. But that's a good one. And it's, these days it's very good to make sure we consciously ask those questions. So appreciate that. Any other thoughts from anyone else in the commission about how to proceed? Is that a good game plan, at least for the next month or so?
I just want to say, so Dave and Heidi, I will reach out to you to set up a meeting time for us. If Corey will be sending out the sample ordinance language by tomorrow, I'll give you guys some time to read through it. So the earliest that we'll meet is probably sometime mid to late next week, which will give you some time to read through everything, if that sounds good to you.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thanks.
Corey and Kathleen, much gratitude to you both for your preparation for this meeting, your work with us all along the way, and for what was a very, very good conversation today. Very helpful to us, and very, very good at helping us kind of not just understand where the kind of passions of the moment lead us, but kind of what we have to do methodically as planners and public officials to kind of make sure we're moving this along in everyone's interest in a way that is, as Jim is reminding us, mindful of our policy objectives and the consequences of what we're doing, as well as what we're trying to achieve. So thank you. We appreciate it, and Thanks. Look forward to your continued help, because we're going to need it. But thank you. I'd like to move on to the last two items on the agenda. The one is the consideration of the omnibus zoning ordinance and the public comment. The omnibus zoning ordinance we did talk about last month. We did vote to recommend to council that council adopt this ordinance. We did flag one structural problem where there was a section of the ordinance that repeated. It was the same thing was in two places, and we said that should be resolved. We've since received correspondence from Montgomery County Planning Commission, its standard review of zoning ordinances, which outlines a few more which are characterized as administrative details, housekeeping things that they are recommending be addressed. And John Walco, in fact, today sent over a revised code addressing those concerns, and he advised that these were, de minimis changes that wouldn't impact the schedule of council opportunity to vote on this. So my question to you is, would you like to discuss any of the items that came up? Would you like to hear about any of the items? I did forward MCPC's letter to you. Would you like to review any of the items or discuss them? Would you like to amend our recommendation to council to encapsulate all of the recommendations MCPC made? That's my question. Would anyone like to weigh in on that?
I would say it's fine the way it is. Excuse me.
I'm sorry, it is
My
fine.
answer to your question is no. It's
Okay.
fine the way it is.
The resolution we passed last time.
Right.
Okay. Any other
My opinion.
thoughts about this? No. Okay. So if there are no other thoughts about this, then we will just let our recommendation stand, and that will be forwarded on to council. Okay. So we will consider that issue closed. The last topic today is public comment. I do see a couple members of the public are with us tonight. Is anyone in the public who is with us tonight interested in making a comment? Just send me a note in the chat and I will recognize you. Meantime, while I'm waiting to see if there's any comments, I do know both people in the meeting did have questions which were answered in our previous conversation. I've received quite a bit of correspondence regarding 3 Elmwood Avenue, which I forwarded to all of you. I believe almost entirely from people on the south side who are either asking us to oppose the project or to offering suggestions about how they would like the project to be modified, and expressing a variety of concerns about the project. I'm not sure whether it serves the purpose to go through them all. I guess with your permission, I'd just like to attach them to the minutes of the meeting, and with recognition that we received them. I did correspond with everyone who submitted a comment and thanked them for the comment and told them that we would not be discussing the application at this meeting, and that I was not certain when it would be on our calendar in the future, so that everyone is aware at least of that things are on pause right now. I guess I would like to say, for the good of whoever is listening, that we did receive some comments which simply asked, literally one comment said, please vote against this proposal. For a planning commissioner, it's not that easy to vote, to simply say, I'm going to vote against a proposal. We actually take an oath of office when we are on a planning commission. I assume among other things, we uphold the Constitution. We also uphold the laws of the state of Pennsylvania. And our role here really in the Planning Commission is to evaluate proposals to see whether or not they're consistent with our codes and ordinances and plans. And if not, to advise the applicants of that. And when we vote on a application, we can vote any way we can, but our responsibility is not simply to vote our own personal preferences, but to vote in a manner that reflects our assessment of whether a application is consistent with the ordinances and plans of the community. Sometimes an application comes up, as I personally said in our meeting last month, that is consistent with our ordinances, but nevertheless is one that is quite challenging for us to look at. In that case, I think our responsibility is to make sure that the public's concerns are aired thoroughly, that the applicants are asked to respond to those concerns, and to the extent possible, the applicants are asked to address those concerns. So I think that's our role here, and then to give our best guidance to council as to whether or not we feel in the context of a project which might technically meet our code, whether or not the applicant has really genuinely addressed what the applicant has heard from the community. So those comments we received that provide suggestions, that explain issues, that provide details about those things are thoroughly welcomed, and they're quite valuable to us to have those. I'll also say to the public that when I receive these comments, I do forward them on to the applicant. So the applicant does receive your comments directly. They've asked to receive your comments. And so I don't want you to think that you send a note and it goes nowhere. We read them, we circulate them, we're acknowledging them tonight, and we do pass them on to the applicant. But in terms of voting for or against a proposal, that as planning commissioners is sort of our charge. So I hope you'll understand that. I hope you'll understand that we do try very hard to work on behalf of the community, even if there are proposals before us that are ones that are very difficult for us to be looking at. So with that, if there are no public comments from anyone in the public tonight, I'll ask for a motion to adjourn. A motion from Jim Cornwell to adjourn. Is there a second?
Second.
Jim Spear. All in favor of adjourning? Aye. Any opposed? Anyone want to stick around? Okay. All right, Maggie, thanks again for everything.
Thank you all so much.
Best wishes.
Thanks, Maggie.
And
you.
au revoir.
Thank you.
Oh.
Best of luck with everything, and everyone stay well, and thank you again so much for being so great to work with over the past few years, and best of luck in all of your upcoming projects.
Thanks. Dave and Heidi, don't let her off easy.
Talk to you soon.
We'll see you next week.
We'll talk next week.
Okay.
All
Take care.
right, everyone. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.